Détente, the great relaxation of the Cold War. Introduction. Détente was one of the most significant diplomatic developments of the 20th century. Emerging during the height of the Cold War, it represented an attempt by the world's two dominant superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, to reduce tensions, manage competition, and prevent the possibility of a catastrophic nuclear conflict. Although the Cold War remained fundamentally a struggle between opposing political, economical, and ideological systems, Détente demonstrated that even bitter rivals could recognize the dangers of unlimited confrontation and seek mechanisms for coexistence. The period of Détente didn't eliminate hostility between the superpowers, rather, it created a framework through which rivalry could be regulated, controlled. Through negotiations, treaties, diplomatic summits, and increased communications, both nations attempted to create a more predictable international environment. The policy influenced military strategy, international diplomacy, economic relations, and the balance of power across the globe. Understanding Détente provides insight into how states manage competition under conditions of extreme danger and how diplomacy can temporarily moderate even the deepest geopolitical conflicts. The origins of the Cold War. To understand Détente, it is necessary to understand the Cold War itself. Following the conclusion of the Second World War in 1945, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union rapidly deteriorated. Although both nations had fought together against Nazi Germany, their visions for the post-war world differed dramatically. The United States championed liberal democracy, capitalism, free markets, and political pluralism. The Soviet Union promoted communism, centralized economic planning, and one-party political rule. These competing ideologies produced mutual suspicion and fear. Each side viewed the other's expansion as a threat to its own security and values. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, tensions intensified. Europe became divided between Eastern and Western blocs. The Berlin Crisis, the Korean War, the formation of military alliances such as NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and numerous intelligence operations increased hostility. Both nations sought to expand their influence around the world while preventing the other from gaining strategic advantages. By the early 1960s, the Cold War had become a truly global struggle. Proxy war, political intervention, espionage, and military buildups characterized international relations. The danger reached its peak during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other time in history. The nuclear shadow, perhaps the most important factor leading to Détente, was the emergence of nuclear weapons. During the early years of the Cold War, both superpowers rapidly expanded their nuclear arsenal. Technological advances allowed the development of increasingly destructive weapons capable of annihilating entire cities within minutes. By the 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other many times over. This condition became known as mutually assured destruction. The logic was simple yet terrifying. Any nuclear attack by any side would trigger a devastating retaliatory strike from the other side, ensuring destruction of both societies. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated how close miscalculation could bring humanity to the disaster. Political leaders on both sides increasingly realized that direct military confrontation could no longer be treated as a viable option. The cost of war had been unacceptable. Consequently, strategic stability and crisis management became essential objectives. Détente emerged partly from this recognition. Both superpowers understood that although competition would continue, mechanisms were needed to reduce misunderstandings and prevent accidental escalation into nuclear conflict. The rise of Détente. The late 1960s witnessed the gradual emergence of Détente. Several factors encouraged this development. The United States faced mounting costs from the Vietnam War and sought greater stability in international affairs. The Soviet Union faced economic challenges and desired access to Western technologies and trade. Both nations recognized that constant confrontation drained resources and increased risks. Political leadership also played crucial roles. American President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger believed that international relations should be guided by pragmatic calculations rather than ideological crusades. They pursued a strategy based on balance of power politics and diplomatic engagement. On the Soviet side, Leonid Brezhnev sought strategic recognition of Soviet power while reducing the risk of conflict. Both governments concluded that structured dialogue could serve their interests better than perpetual hostility. Détente didn't represent friendship, instead, it represented a calculated effort to manage competition. The superpowers remained rivals, but they increasingly viewed communication and negotiation as necessary tools of statecraft. Strategic arms limitation talks. One of the most important achievements of Détente was the strategic arms limitation talks, commonly known as SALT. These negotiations sought to place limits on the growth of nuclear arsenal and establish greater predictability in military affairs. The first major agreement, SALT I, was signed in 1972. It froze the number of certain strategic missile systems that established important limitations on anti-ballistic missile defenses. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty restricted the deployment of defensive systems designed to intercept nuclear missiles. This agreement reflected a paradox of nuclear strategy. Both sides concluded that excessive defensive capabilities could destabilize deterrence by encouraging first strikes. By limiting defenses, they sought to preserve strategic balance and reduce incentives for aggressive action. SALT I represented a landmark achievement because it demonstrated that adversaries could negotiate constraints on their most powerful weapons. It did not eliminate nuclear arms, but it established the principle that arms control was possible. Nixon's diplomacy and realpolitik. Richard Nixon's foreign policy played a central role in the development of Détente. Nixon approached international relations through the lens of realpolitik, emphasizing practical national interests rather than ideological confrontation. His administration pursued a more flexible approach towards both the Soviet Union and Communist China. In 1972, Nixon made his historic visit to China, opening relations with a country that had been largely isolated from the United States. This diplomatic breakthrough altered the global balance of power. The growing split between China and the Soviet Union created opportunities for American diplomacy. By improving relations with China, the United States gained leverage in negotiations with Moscow. At the same time, the Soviet Union became more interested in stabilizing relations with Washington. The triangular diplomacy helped create conditions favorable to Détente. Rather than viewing global politics as a simple two-sided conflict, policymakers increasingly operated with a more complex strategic environment. Economic and cultural cooperation. Détente extended beyond military affairs. Economic relations between East and West expanded significantly during the 1970s. Trade agreements increased and the Soviet Union sought access to Western technology, agricultural products, and financial resources. Cultural exchanges also became more common. Scientists, artists, students, athletes, and academics participated in programs designed to improve mutual understanding. Although ideological differences remained profound, greater conflict reduced some of the misconceptions that characterized earlier periods of hostility. These exchanges reflected the belief that communication could contribute to stability. By increasing interactions between societies, leaders hope to reduce the likelihood of dangerous misunderstandings and create incentives for peaceful cooperation. While the practical impact of these exchanges varied, they symbolized a broader effort to humanize relations between two competing systems. The Helsinki Accords. Another major achievement of Détente was the Helsinki Accords of 1975. Signed by numerous countries from Europe and North America, these agreements addressed issues related to security, economic cooperation, and human rights. The Accords recognized existing European borders and sought to promote stability across the continent. For Soviet Union, this represented an important acknowledgement of post-war territorial agreements. For Western countries, the human rights provisions offered opportunities to challenge Soviet practices and support dissident movements. Although initially viewed as a diplomatic compromise, the human rights commitments eventually contributed to political pressures within Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc. Activists and reformers frequently cited the Accords when demanding greater freedom and government accountability. Thus, the Helsinki process produced consequences that extended far beyond its original intentions. The limits of Détente. Despite its achievements, Détente faced significant challenges. Fundamental ideological differences remained unresolved. The United States and Soviet Union continued to compete for influence across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Proxy conflicts persisted. Both superpowers supported allied governments, insurgencies, and military interventions around the world. Many critics argued that Détente merely masked continuing rivalry rather than transforming it. Domestic politics also complicated that process. In the United States, some policymakers believed that Détente allowed the Soviet Union to gain strategic advantages while avoiding meaningful concessions. In the Soviet Union, hardliners worried that increased openness could weaken ideological discipline. The tensions revealed the fundamental weakness of Détente. While leaders could negotiate agreements, they could not eliminate the underlying competition that defined the Cold War. The collapse of Détente. The late 1970s witnessed the gradual collapse of Détente. Several developments contributed to this decline. Strategic competition intensified in various regions, including Africa and the Middle East. Disagreements over human rights became increasingly contentious. The decisive turning point occurred in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The intervention shocked Western governments and was widely interpreted as evidence of Soviet expansionism. The United States responded with sanctions, diplomatic protests, and support for Afghan resistance powers. Trust between the superpowers deteriorated rapidly. Arms control negotiations stalled, and political rhetoric became increasingly hostile. The election of President Ronald Reagan further accelerated the shift towards confrontation. Reagan adopted a more aggressive posture towards the Soviet Union, criticized Détente as a flawed strategy. By the late 1980s, the era of Détente had effectively ended. A renewed period of Cold War tensions emerged, marked by military buildups and intensified ideological conflict. The legacy of Détente. Although Détente ultimately failed to create lasting harmony, its historical significance remains substantial. It demonstrated that even intense geopolitical rivals could negotiate agreements, establish communication channels, and reduce the risk of catastrophic conflicts. Many of the diplomatic practices developed during Détente continued to influence international relations. Arms control negotiations, crisis management mechanisms, and summit diplomacy became standard features of superpower interaction. The experience also showed that strategic competition and diplomatic engagement are not mutually exclusive. States can simultaneously compete and cooperate when circumstances require it. Perhaps more importantly, Détente helped prevent dangerous escalation during one of the most heavily armed periods in human history. By creating channels for dialogue, it reduced the likelihood that misunderstandings would trigger nuclear war. The lessons of Détente remains relevant even today. Modern rivalries between major powers continue to raise questions about deterrence, arms control, communications, and strategic stability. The experience of the 1970s illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of diplomacy in a divided world. Conclusion. Détente was neither peace nor friendship. It was a pragmatic response to the realities of nuclear competition and global rivalry. Faced with the prospect of mutual destruction, the United States and Soviet Union sought ways to manage their conflict without abandoning their competing ambitions. Through arms control agreements, diplomatic engagement, economic exchanges, and international cooperation, Détente temporarily reduced tensions and created a more stable international environment. Yet the underlying ideological, strategic, and geopolitical conflicts remained unresolved. These unresolved tensions ultimately contributed to its collapse. Despite its limitation, Détente stands as one of the most important diplomatic experiments of the Cold War. It demonstrated that even in periods of profound hostility, states can recognize shared interest, negotiate constraints, and pursue stability in a world where great power competition continues to shape international politics. The history of Détente remains an enduring lesson in the possibilities and challenges of diplomacy.